The fire started in the mercantile just as the blizzard reached its full fury, and Theresa Thompson knew she had mere minutes to live as the flames devoured the wooden building around her, while snow piled against the windows in drifts that would trap her inside. She had been restocking the back shelves when she heard the crash from the front room, the overturned lamp that her employer had warned her about a dozen times, and by the time she smelled the smoke and ran toward the front, the entire doorway was already engulfed in orange flames that licked hungrily at the dry timber ceiling. The heat slammed into her face like a physical force, driving her backward even as her mind screamed at her to run through it, to take her chances with the burns rather than the certainty of death by smoke and flame if she stayed. But her body would not obey, her legs trembling as she backed away from the roaring inferno that had once been the only exit from this cramped storage room, where barrels of flour and sacks of coffee beans now seemed like they might become her tomb. Outside in the brutal cold of January 1882, Vincent Crane pulled his coat tighter and squinted against the driving snow that felt like needles against his exposed skin. Body, California had seen bad winters before, high up in these mountains where gold and silver had drawn men willing to risk everything for fortune. But this storm was something different, something that made even the old-timers shake their heads and hurry for shelter. He had just left the saloon where he had been playing cards with 3 miners who could not hold their liquor worth a damn, and he had been planning to head to the boarding house where he kept a room when he saw the orange glow through the white curtain of falling snow. Fire in a blizzard seemed like an impossibility, like nature could not decide whether to freeze them or burn them. But Vincent had learned long ago that the world did not care much about what seemed possible or impossible. He broke into a run, his boots slipping on the ice beneath the fresh snow, and he could hear shouting now from other directions as more people spotted the flames. The mercantile was a 2-story building right on Main Street, and if it went up completely, the fire could spread to the buildings on either side despite the storm. Vincent had no particular love for Bodie, this rough mining town where he had been working as a ranch hand for the past 8 months. But he had even less love for standing by while people died. As he got closer, he could see that the front of the building was completely engulfed, the windows blown out from the heat, flames reaching out into the snow as if trying to melt away the winter itself. "Anyone inside?" he shouted to a man standing near the edge of the growing crowd, someone he recognized as the blacksmith whose shop was 2 doors down. "Thompson's girl," the man shouted back, his face twisted with horror. "Miss Theresa, she was working late inventory." Vincent did not stop to think about it, did not pause to consider the odds or calculate his chances of survival. He yanked his coat off and plunged it into the water trough that sat outside the mercantile, the surface covered with a thin sheet of ice that cracked under the pressure. The coat came up dripping and already starting to freeze in the bitter air, and he wrapped it around his head and shoulders like a cloak. Someone grabbed his arm, tried to pull him back, told him he was crazy, but Vincent shook them off and ran straight for the flames. The heat hit him like a wall even through the wet coat, and he could hear the sizzle and steam as the moisture evaporated almost instantly. The front door was gone, just a rectangle of pure fire, and Vincent lowered his head and charged through it. Inside was hell itself, the air so hot it seared his lungs with each breath, the smoke so thick he could barely see 3 feet in front of him. He dropped low where the air was slightly clearer and shouted her name. "Theresa! Theresa Thompson!" No answer came, just the roar of the fire and the crack of burning timber. Vincent crawled forward, one hand stretched out in front of him, feeling his way through a room he had been in 100 times, but now could not recognize. His coat was smoking now, the water gone, and he could feel the heat beginning to penetrate through to his skin. He was going to die in here, he realized with a strange calm. Die in this damn mercantile trying to save a woman he had only spoken to maybe 3 times in the past 8 months. Then he heard it, a cough from somewhere to his right, toward the back where they kept the storage room. Vincent changed direction, pulling himself along the floor, and his hand hit a display case that had fallen over, the glass long since shattered from the heat. He pushed past it and saw a door, the wood already starting to blacken and curl from the flames that were racing across the ceiling above him. He hit the door with his shoulder, and it flew open, revealing a room that was not yet fully engulfed, but would be within seconds as fire raced along the walls. Theresa was huddled in the far corner, her apron pulled up over her mouth and nose, her eyes streaming with tears from the smoke. When she saw him, something like hope flickered across her face. followed immediately by terror as a beam fell from the ceiling between them, showering sparks and sending up a wave of heat that made Vincent's eyes water. He could not go around it. The room was too small and too full of merchandise that was rapidly becoming kindling, so he did the only thing he could. He ran straight at it and jumped. His boots hit the burning beam, and he launched himself across it, feeling the heat through the leather, landing hard on the other side and rolling to absorb the impact. He was up in an instant, grabbing Theresa by the arm and pulling her to her feet. She was coughing too hard to speak, her face covered in soot, and he did not waste time trying to explain. He pulled what was left of his smoking coat off and wrapped it around her as best he could, then lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, or maybe the desperation gave him strength he did not normally possess. "Hold on to me and do not let go no matter what," he said, his voice raw from the smoke. She nodded and wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face against his shoulder. Vincent turned back toward the door and saw that the beam he had jumped was now fully engulfed, flames reaching up from it like grasping fingers. There was no going around it and no time to find another way. He tightened his grip on Theresa, said a prayer to a god he was not sure he believed in, and ran straight at the flames. The fire seemed to reach for them as they passed through it, and Vincent felt his hair singe and the exposed skin on his hands and neck scream in protest. But then they were through and into the main room. The front door seemed impossibly far away, a rectangle of white snow and gray sky visible through the inferno, and between here and there was a gauntlet of fallen merchandise, burning shelves, and a ceiling that looked like it might collapse at any second. Vincent did not slow down. He charged through it all, his boots hitting burning planks, his shoulders slamming into door frames, Theresa's grip around his neck so tight he could barely breathe, but he did not ask her to loosen it. They burst out into the blizzard, and Vincent kept running, putting distance between them and the building, not stopping until they were across the street and the crowd surged around them. Hands reached for Theresa, pulling her from his arms, and other hands grabbed him as his legs gave out, and he collapsed onto the snowy ground. The cold air felt like knives in his lungs after the superheated smoke, and he coughed so hard he thought he might bring up blood. Someone was pouring water on his hands, and he looked down to see that his skin was red and already starting to blister, though he had not felt the pain yet through the adrenaline. "You damn fool," someone said, but they were laughing as they said it, the kind of relieved laughter that comes after terror. "You beautiful damn fool." Vincent managed to sit up and looked around for Theresa. She was a few feet away, surrounded by women who were checking her over, wrapping blankets around her shoulders, pressing a cup of water to her lips. As if she felt his gaze, she looked up, and their eyes met across the chaos of the crowd. Her face was streaked with soot and tears. Her honey-colored hair had come loose from its pins and hung in wild tangles around her shoulders, and Vincent thought she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Then the pain hit, his hands and neck and face all screaming at once, and the world tilted sideways as someone caught him before he hit the ground. He woke up in a bed that was not his own, in a room he did not recognize, with bandages wrapped around both hands and a burning sensation across his face and neck that told him he had been hurt worse than he realized in the moment. A woman was sitting in a chair beside the bed, her head tilted back against the wall, asleep. It took him a moment to recognize Theresa through the fog of pain and whatever medicine they had given him, but once he did, he found he could not look away. In sleep, her face had relaxed from the terror he had seen in the mercantile, but he could still see the smudges of soot in her hairline that she had not quite washed away, the redness around her eyes from the smoke. "You should not be here," he said, his voice coming out as a croak. Her eyes flew open and she sat forward so fast the chair nearly tipped over. "You are awake," she said, and her voice was rough too, damaged from the smoke. "The doctor said you would sleep through the night at least. What time is it?" "Just past dawn. The storm is still going." She stood and moved to the bedside, her hands twisting together nervously. "How do you feel?" "Like I ran through a burning building," Vincent said, and was rewarded with a small smile. "You should not be here," he said again. "You need to rest." "I have been resting all night while you were unconscious," Theresa said. "I wanted to be here when you woke up. I needed to thank you for saving my life." Vincent tried to wave it off and discovered that moving his bandaged hands sent lightning bolts of pain up his arms. "Anyone would have done the same," he managed through gritted teeth. "That is not true, and you know it," Theresa said softly. She pulled the chair closer to the bed and sat down again, leaning forward with her elbows on her knees. Half the men in this town would have stood outside and wrung their hands and talked about what a shame it was. You ran into a burning building in the middle of a blizzard without a second thought. That is not something anyone would do. That is something you did. Vincent did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing. In the silence, he could hear the wind howling outside, the blizzard that had tried to freeze them, now containing the fire that had tried to burn them. Nature was nothing if not efficient. The doctor said your hands will heal, Theresa continued, and he could hear the guilt in her voice. But that you will have scars. I am so sorry. Sorry for what? You did not start the fire. But you were hurt because of me. I was hurt because I made a choice, Vincent said firmly, and I would make the same choice again. He met her eyes and held them. I would do it 100 times if it meant you were safe. Something shifted in her expression, a softness mixed with confusion, as if she could not quite understand why this man she barely knew would say such a thing. Vincent was not entirely sure himself. He knew her name, knew she worked at the mercantile, knew she had come to Bodie about a year ago from somewhere back east after her parents died. He knew she had auburn hair that caught the light like copper and green eyes that always seemed to be watching the world with a quiet intelligence. He knew that the few times they had spoken, her voice had made him think of music boxes and Sunday mornings, things from a childhood so long ago they might as well have belonged to someone else. But he did not know her, not really, and yet he had been willing to die for her without hesitation. It was a puzzle he did not have the energy to solve right now. "Where am I?" he asked, changing the subject. "The boarding house. Mrs. Patterson gave up her best room for you. The whole town has been asking after you." Theresa smiled again, more genuinely this time. "You are quite the hero." "I am a ranch hand who got lucky," Vincent said. But even as he said it, he knew it was not entirely true. Luck had been part of it, but so had stubbornness and a refusal to accept the world as it was handed to him. Those traits had served him well in his 30 years, though they had also gotten him into more trouble than he cared to remember. A knock on the door interrupted them, and a woman Vincent recognized as Mrs. Patterson, the boarding house owner, poked her head in. She was a sturdy woman in her 50s with gray-streaked hair and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who had raised 6 children and buried 2 husbands. "Good, you are awake," she said briskly. "Miss Theresa, you need to go home and get some proper sleep. You have been here all night and you are still recovering yourself. Mr. Crane is not going anywhere, and I will look after him." Theresa looked like she wanted to argue, but Mrs. Patterson had the kind of authority that did not brook disagreement. She stood reluctantly, smoothing down her skirt. "I will come back this afternoon to check on you," she said to Vincent. "You do not have to do that," he said, even though part of him very much wanted her to. "I know," Theresa said simply, "but I am going to anyway." After she left, Mrs. Patterson came fully into the room, carrying a tray with a bowl of broth and some bread. "Let us see about getting some food into you," she said. "You need your strength to heal." Over the next week, Vincent learned several things. He learned that second-degree burns hurt worse on the second and third day than they did initially. He learned that being unable to use his hands made him feel helpless in a way he had never experienced before, dependent on others for everything from eating to getting dressed. He learned that the mercantile had burned to the ground despite the efforts of the bucket brigade, and that old man Thompson who owned it had lost everything since he had not had insurance on the building or the inventory. But most importantly, he learned that Theresa Thompson was true to her word. She came every afternoon and sat with him, sometimes for just an hour, sometimes until the sun set and Mrs. Patterson chased her out. At first, they talked about simple things, the weather, the town gossip, the progress of his healing. But as the days passed and Vincent regained the use of his hands enough to sit up and move around, their conversations deepened. He learned that she had grown up in Philadelphia, the only child of a pharmacist father and a schoolteacher mother. They had died within 6 months of each other from influenza, leaving her alone at 19 with no other family and no prospects. Her father's business partner had bought out his share of the pharmacy for a pittance, barely enough to cover the debts and funeral costs, and Theresa had found herself adrift in a city that suddenly felt hostile and cold. "I saw an advertisement for a mercantile clerk in Bodie," she told him one afternoon, while she helped him practice flexing his healing hands, the exercises the doctor had prescribed to prevent the scars from tightening too much. It promised room and board, plus wages. I had never been west of Pennsylvania, but there was nothing left for me in Philadelphia, so I packed a single trunk and bought a train ticket as far as Reno. From there, I took a stagecoach, and then I rode in the back of a supply wagon for the last leg, because the stage did not run all the way to Bodie. It took me 3 weeks to get here, and I spent every mile wondering if I had made a terrible mistake. Had you? Vincent asked. Theresa considered this, her fingers still wrapped around his as she gently pressed his hand open and closed. Her touch was warm and careful, and Vincent found himself looking forward to these exercises far more than he probably should. I do not know, she said honestly. Bodie is nothing like Philadelphia. It is rough and wild, and half the buildings look like they might blow away in a strong wind. The summer is too hot and the winter is too cold, and there are more saloons than churches, more gamblers than farmers. But there is something here too, something I cannot quite name. A feeling that you can be whoever you want to be, that your past does not have to define your future. Does that make sense? More than you know, Vincent said quietly. She looked up at him, her green eyes curious. What brought you to Bodie? You have never said. It was true. He had deflected every time she asked about his past, but sitting here with her hand in his, he found he wanted to tell her, wanted her to know him the way he was beginning to know her. I am from Texas originally, he said. My father had a small ranch, nothing fancy, but enough to make a living. I was the youngest of 4 boys, which meant I was always going to inherit the least, so I left when I was 17 to make my own way. I worked as a cowhand on ranches all across Texas and New Mexico, saved my money, learned everything I could about horses and cattle and land management. I had this idea that I would save enough to buy my own piece of land, start my own ranch, build something that was mine. What happened? Theresa asked softly. I met a woman, Vincent said with a rueful smile. Or I thought I did. Her name was Catherine, and she was the daughter of a ranch owner I worked for outside Santa Fe. She was beautiful and charming, and she made me feel like I was the only man in the world when she looked at me. We courted for 6 months, and I asked her to marry me. She said yes. I took every cent I had saved over 10 years, bought a ring and a small parcel of land just outside town, started building a house with my own hands. He paused, the memory still sharp even after all these years. Theresa did not push, just waited, her thumb making small circles on the back of his hand. 2 weeks before the wedding, I came home early from working on the house and found her in the barn with the foreman, Vincent continued. She had never loved me, she told me. She had just wanted someone who would buy her nice things and treat her like a lady until someone better came along. The foreman had money from his family back east, a real fortune, not the pennies I had managed to scrape together. She married him 3 months later. Vincent, I am so sorry, Theresa said, and he could hear the genuine pain in her voice. He shrugged, though it had taken him years to be able to do so without feeling the ache of betrayal. I sold the land at a loss, kept moving west. I have been in California for about 2 years now, mostly working ranches, moving from place to place. I am good with horses and I do not cause trouble, so I can always find work. I ended up in Bodie last summer when I heard they needed hands at the Creek Ranch just outside town. The pay is decent, and it is as good a place as any to spend some time. Do you ever think about settling down, buying that land and starting that ranch you dreamed about? Vincent looked at her, at this woman who had somehow become the best part of his days over the past week, and chose his words carefully. I used to think that dream died with Catherine's betrayal, but lately I have been thinking maybe it just went to sleep for a while. Maybe it is time to wake it up again. Something flickered in Theresa's eyes, a question or a hope, but before she could respond, Mrs. Patterson knocked and entered with Vincent's dinner. The moment passed, but Vincent found himself thinking about it long after Theresa had left for the evening. 2 weeks after the fire, the doctor pronounced Vincent healed enough to return to work, though he cautioned him to be careful with his hands for at least another month. The scars were pink and shiny, running across his palms and the backs of his hands, twisting the skin in places where the burns had been deepest. They would fade with time, the doctor assured him, but they would never fully disappear. Vincent found he did not mind. Every time he looked at them, he would remember running through flames to pull Theresa from certain death, and that seemed like a worthy thing to carry with him. The problem was that returning to work meant returning to the ranch, which was an hour's ride from town, and he would be staying in the bunkhouse with the other hands rather than coming into Bodie every day. It meant he would not see Theresa every afternoon, would not have those hours of conversation and connection that had become the highlight of his existence. He was thinking about this as he walked down Main Street toward the livery stable where he had boarded his horse. The morning cold but clear, after the blizzard had finally blown itself out 3 days ago. The town was still digging out from under several feet of snow, and the work of clearing the ruins of the mercantile had not yet begun. He was so lost in thought that he almost did not see Theresa until she called his name. She was standing outside what used to be the mercantile, dressed in a heavy coat and wool gloves, her breath making clouds in the cold air. Her cheeks were pink from the chill, and her hair was pulled back in a practical braid, and Vincent felt his heart do something complicated in his chest at the sight of her. "I heard you were released by the doctor," she said as he walked over to her. "I wanted to catch you before you left for the ranch." "I was going to come find you," Vincent said, "to say goodbye." "It is not goodbye," Theresa said firmly. "You will have days off. You can come into town." "Sure," Vincent said, but they both knew it would not be the same. Ranch work was hard and the days were long, and by the time he had a day off, he would be too tired to do much more than sleep and maybe play cards at the saloon. The easy intimacy they had built over the past 2 weeks would fade, replaced by the awkwardness of acquaintances who saw each other occasionally, but had no real place in each other's daily lives. Theresa seemed to be thinking the same thing, because she looked down at her hands, then back up at him, with a determined expression he was coming to recognize. "I have been offered a position," she said. "Teaching at the school. It does not pay much, but it comes with a room, and the teacher who left got married and moved to San Francisco, so they are desperate for someone with any education at all. I thought about saying no, because I am not sure I am qualified. But then I thought about what I said to you about Body being a place where you can be whoever you want to be, and I realized I was being a coward." "You are many things, Theresa Thompson, but a coward is not one of them," Vincent said. "You should take the position. You will be a wonderful teacher." "That is what I wanted to talk to you about," Theresa said, and now she looked nervous, her gloved hands twisting together. "I wanted to know if you would help me. The schoolhouse needs repairs, things I cannot do myself. The roof leaks and half the windows do not close properly, and the stove has not worked right in years. I know you are busy at the ranch, but I thought maybe on your days off, if you were not too tired, you might be willing to help me fix it up. I can pay you, not much, but something." Vincent understood what she was really asking, and the hope that bloomed in his chest was almost painful. "I do not want your money," he said, "but I would be happy to help you fix up the schoolhouse. Consider it repayment for keeping me company while I was laid up." "You do not owe me anything," Theresa said. "You saved my life, and you made my recovery bearable instead of miserable," Vincent countered. "Seems to me we are even." She smiled, and it was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. "Then we have an agreement?" "We have an agreement." They stood there in the cold for another moment, neither quite willing to say goodbye, until finally Vincent forced himself to tip his hat and turn toward the livery stable. He had gone maybe 10 steps when Theresa called after him. "Vincent?" He turned back. "I am glad you did not die in that fire," she said, and her voice was thick with emotion. "I am really, really glad." "Me too," Vincent said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. The ranch kept him busy for the next week, as he had known it would. Late February was calving season, which meant long nights checking on the pregnant cows, pulling difficult births, making sure the newborn calves survived their first crucial hours. Vincent had always liked this time of year, despite the exhaustion, liked the feeling of helping bring new life into the world, liked the satisfaction of seeing a wobbly-legged calf take its first steps. But this year, his mind kept wandering back to Bodie, to a certain auburn-haired schoolteacher who was probably trying to teach a room full of unruly children their letters and numbers. He wondered how she was managing, whether the children liked her, whether she was staying warm in whatever room they had given her. The bunkhouse felt emptier than usual, the conversation with the other hands less interesting, the hours between now and his next day off stretching endlessly ahead. When Sunday finally came, and the foreman told him he could take the day to rest, Vincent was up before dawn, cleaning up as best he could with the limited facilities in the bunkhouse, putting on his cleanest shirt, trying to tame his dark hair which had gotten too long and tended to curl at the ends when it needed cutting. The other hands gave him good-natured grief about it, asking if he had a girl in town, and Vincent just smiled and did not answer, which made them hoot with laughter and slap him on the back. The ride into Bodie took a little over an hour, and Vincent used the time to rehearse what he would say to Theresa. He had been thinking about her constantly over the past week, and what he felt went far beyond simple attraction or gratitude. There was a rightness to being around her, a sense of peace and possibility that he had not felt since before Catherine's betrayal. He was 30 years old, too old to play games or pretend he did not feel what he felt. If Theresa did not feel the same way, he would accept that and help her with the schoolhouse anyway because he had given his word. But he needed to know, needed to put it out there and see what happened. The schoolhouse was on the edge of town, a small structure that looked even more weathered and worn than Vincent remembered. He could see smoke coming from the chimney, which meant Theresa had managed to get the stove working, and as he rode closer, he heard the sound of hammering coming from inside. He tied his horse to the hitching post and climbed the steps, knocking on the door frame, even though the door was propped open. The hammering stopped, and Theresa appeared from behind a row of desks, her hair tied up in a kerchief, her sleeves rolled up despite the cold, a hammer in one hand. Her face lit up when she saw him, and Vincent felt that complicated thing happen in his chest again. "You came," she said, and she sounded genuinely surprised, as if she had not quite believed he would. "I said I would," Vincent replied, stepping inside. The schoolhouse was a single large room, with rows of desks facing a blackboard at the front. Windows lined both sides, though several of them had been boarded over where the glass had broken. The ceiling showed water stains from the leaky roof, and the whole place smelled of dust and chalk and old wood. "What are you working on?" "One of the desks had a broken leg," Theresa said, gesturing to the desk in question, which she had turned upside down. "I thought I could fix it myself, but I'm not very good with a hammer." Vincent examined her repair work and had to suppress a smile. She had managed to nail the leg back on, but it was crooked and would probably fall off again the first time a student sat at the desk. "Here, let me," he said, pulling out the bent nails and positioning the leg properly. "You need to make sure it is straight first, then drive the nail in at an angle so it has something to grip." Theresa watched him work, and he was acutely aware of her proximity, the warmth of her even in the cold room. When the desk was fixed and turned right side up, she tested it with her weight, and it held firm. "You make it look so easy," she said. "Just practice," Vincent said. "What else needs doing?" They spent the next several hours working on the schoolhouse, and Vincent found a kind of contentment in the simple labor. He patched the holes in the roof where he could reach them, though some would require him to bring a proper ladder next time. He fixed the windows that could be fixed, and made a list of the panes that would need replacing. He took apart the stove and cleaned out years of accumulated ash and debris, replaced a cracked section of pipe, and got it burning cleanly and efficiently. Theresa worked alongside him, handing him tools, holding boards steady while he nailed them, sweeping up the mess they made. They talked while they worked, the conversation flowing easily between them. She told him about her first week of teaching, how the children had tested her mercifully until she had proven she could be both kind and firm. He told her about the calving season, about a particularly difficult birth he had assisted with that had resulted in twin calves, a rare and lucky occurrence. They laughed together and worked together, and by the time the sun started to set, Vincent realized he had not thought about Catherine or Santa Fe or his failed dreams even once all day. He had been too busy living in the present, too busy enjoying the company of a woman who made him want to dream new dreams. As they stood on the steps of the schoolhouse, watching the sun paint the mountains orange and pink, Vincent decided it was time to say what he had come to say. "Theresa, I need to tell you something." She turned to look at him, her expression open and curious. "What is it?" "I have been thinking about you," he said, the words coming out more bluntly than he intended. "A lot. More than I probably should, given that we barely know each other. But these past few weeks, getting to know you, talking with you, being around you, it has made me realize something. I am not good at pretty words or flowery speeches, so I am just going to say it plain. I have feelings for you, Theresa. Real feelings. And I need to know if there is any chance you might feel the same way." Theresa was quiet for a long moment, her face unreadable in the fading light, and Vincent felt his heart sink. He had misread the situation, mistaken her kindness and gratitude for something more. He opened his mouth to tell her to forget he said anything, to apologize for making things awkward, but before he could speak, she stepped forward and kissed him. It was a soft kiss, tentative and sweet, and it sent electricity singing through every nerve in Vincent's body. When she pulled back, her cheeks were flushed and her eyes were bright. "I have been thinking about you too," she said quietly. "Every day you were at the ranch, I found myself counting the hours until Sunday, hoping you would come, afraid you would not. I have never felt this way before, this certainty that something is right even though it is happening so fast. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," Vincent said, and kissed her again, deeper this time, his scarred hands coming up to cup her face gently. She leaned into him, her own hands gripping his coat, and for a moment the cold and the wind and the rough mining town around them all fell away. There was just this, just her, just the feeling of something new and fragile and precious beginning to take root. They courted properly after that, by the standards of Bodie, which were somewhat less formal than the standards of Philadelphia or even Santa Fe. Vincent came into town every Sunday, and sometimes on Wednesday evenings if he could get away early, and they spent their time fixing up the schoolhouse, walking through town, sharing meals at the boarding house under Mrs. Patterson's watchfully approving eye. The whole town knew about them within a week because gossip traveled faster than wildfire in a place like Bodie, and Vincent found himself subjected to an endless stream of teasing from the other ranch hands and pointed questions from the townspeople about his intentions. His intentions, he discovered, were entirely honorable. He had thought himself incapable of falling in love again after Catherine had armored his heart so thoroughly that he did not think anyone could penetrate it. But Theresa had somehow slipped past all his defenses, not through any grand gesture or manipulation, but simply by being herself. She was intelligent and kind and funny, practical-minded, but with a streak of romantic idealism that manifested in the way she talked about her students, about the potential she saw in each of them. She challenged him, made him think about things differently, but she also accepted him as he was, scars and all, both the literal ones on his hands and the metaphorical ones on his heart. By April, when the snow had melted and the first wildflowers were starting to bloom in the high meadows around Bodie, Vincent knew he wanted to marry her. The knowledge did not come as a thunderbolt or a sudden revelation, but rather as a quiet certainty that had been building since the moment he carried her out of the burning mercantile. This was the woman he wanted to build a life with, the woman he wanted beside him, through all the joys and sorrows that lay ahead. The question was whether she felt the same way, and whether she would be willing to take a chance on a cowhand with more scars than prospects. Vincent had saved most of his wages over the years, enough to buy a small piece of land if he was careful, but starting a ranch from nothing was hard, dangerous work with no guarantee of success. He would be asking Theresa to give up the security of her teaching position, to bet her future on him, and that was not a small thing. He decided to ask her anyway because the alternative was to let fear dictate his choices, and he had done too much of that already. On a Sunday in late April, he rode into town with a ring in his pocket that he had bought from the jeweler 3 days ago, a simple gold band with a small garnet stone, because he remembered her mentioning once that garnets reminded her of her mother's favorite brooch. His plan was to take her on a picnic up to one of the meadows outside town, to find a pretty spot with a view of the mountains, to say everything he had been rehearsing in his head for weeks. But when he got to the schoolhouse, he found Theresa sitting on the steps, her face pale, and her eyes red-rimmed from crying. All thoughts of proposals and picnics fled from his mind as he dismounted and hurried over to her. "What happened? Are you hurt?" She shook her head, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "I received a letter," she said, her voice thick, "from Philadelphia. It seems my father's business partner has died, and his widow found some papers while settling his estate. Papers that show he vastly underpaid for my father's share of the pharmacy. She is an honest woman, and she has sent me the difference, with interest. Vincent, it is over $3,000. Vincent let out a low whistle. That was a fortune, more money than most people in Bodie would see in 5 years of hard work. "That is wonderful news," he said, confused by her tears. "Why are you crying?" "Because everything is about to change," Theresa said miserably. $3,000 is enough to go back east, to set myself up properly in a city where there are real opportunities. I could open a school of my own, or invest it and live off the interest. I could go anywhere, do anything. Everyone is going to expect me to leave Bodie, to go back to civilization where I belong. Understanding dawned, cold and terrible. And what do you want to do? Vincent asked, even though he was afraid of the answer. Theresa looked up at him, her green eyes searching his face. What is there for me here, Vincent? Be honest. We have been courting for 2 months, and it has been wonderful. But what is this? Where is it going? You work on a ranch an hour from town. I teach school here. We see each other once or twice a week if we are lucky. That is not a life. That is just marking time. The words stung, but Vincent could not deny the truth in them. He pulled the ring box from his pocket and held it out to her. This is what I came here to give you today, he said quietly. This is where I thought it was going. Theresa stared at the box, her hand coming up to cover her mouth. Vincent, she whispered. I love you, he said simply. I have loved you since I pulled you out of that fire, maybe even before that if I am being completely honest. I know I am not much, just a cowhand with some savings and a lot of dreams. But I want to build something real with you. I want to buy some land and start a ranch and fill it with horses and cattle and maybe someday children. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to grow old with you, Theresa. That is what I want. She was crying again, but these tears looked different somehow. I want that too, she said. So much it scares me. But I also know what happens when people try to build dreams on nothing but love and hope. I have seen it in this town, the abandoned claims and the failed businesses and the wives left alone while their husbands chase the next big strike. I do not want that for us. Then we will do it different, Vincent said, kneeling down on the step beside her. We will be smart and careful, and we will build something that lasts. Your money, my savings, that gives us a real chance. We can buy good land with water access, we can stock it properly, we can hire help when we need it. This does not have to be a fantasy, Theresa. This can be real if we make it together. She searched his face, looking for something, and whatever she found there must have satisfied her, because she took the box from his hand and opened it. The ring glinted in the morning sun, and when she slipped it on her finger, it fit perfectly. Yes, she said, her voice breaking. Yes, I will marry you. I will build a life with you. I will take this crazy leap and pray we can fly. Vincent kissed her then, right there on the steps of the schoolhouse, and he did not care that Mrs. Patterson was watching from across the street, or that a group of miners passing by started whooping and hollering. All that mattered was that she had said yes, that she was his and he was hers, that they were going to make this work no matter what. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the church, with half of Bodie in attendance because the story of how he had saved her from the fire had become the stuff of local legend. Theresa wore a dress of pale blue silk that she had ordered from San Francisco, and Vincent wore a new suit that made him feel stiff and uncomfortable, but which Theresa said made him look impossibly handsome. Mrs. Patterson cried through the entire ceremony, and the owner of the saloon gave them a wedding dinner free of charge, and the miners passed a hat around and collected enough money to buy them a beautiful set of dishes that Theresa promptly burst into tears over. Vincent moved out of the bunkhouse at the ranch and gave his notice, and they spent their first month of marriage living at the boarding house while they looked for land. It was Theresa who found the perfect spot, 160 acres about 5 miles south of Bodie, with a creek running through it and good grazing land. The price was more than fair because the previous owner had died, and his children back east just wanted to unload it. They bought it with a mixture of her inheritance and his savings, and suddenly they were landowners, ranchers, people with something real to build on. The first year was hard in ways that Vincent had expected and ways he had not. Building a house from scratch while also trying to establish a herd and plant hay fields and dig a proper well was backbreaking work that left him exhausted every night. Money went faster than he had anticipated, spent on lumber and nails and barbed wire, and the breeding stock they needed to get the ranch started. There were setbacks, like when they lost 3 calves to a late spring snowstorm, and the time when Vincent broke his leg falling from a ladder and was laid up for 6 weeks. But through it all, Theresa was beside him, working as hard as he did, never complaining even when her hands were blistered and her back ached. She learned to milk cows and tend chickens and ride a horse well enough to help move cattle from one pasture to another. She kept the books and managed their money with a careful eye that kept them from spending more than they could afford. And every night, no matter how tired they were, they found time to sit together on the porch of their half-finished house and watch the sun set over their land, their ranch, their future. There were good moments too, bright spots of joy that made all the hard work worthwhile. The first time they sold a crop of hay to the mines in Bodie and realized they had made a profit. The day they finished the house and moved in, sleeping in their own bedroom, in their own home for the first time. The evening Vincent came in from checking the herd to find Theresa waiting for him, with tears streaming down her face and joy in her eyes, telling him she was pregnant with their first child. Their son was born in March of 1884, delivered by the doctor from Bodie, with Mrs. Patterson assisting. They named him James after Theresa's father, and Vincent thought he had never seen anything as perfect as his wife holding their baby, her face glowing with love and exhaustion. James had his mother's eyes and his father's dark hair, and from the moment he came into the world, he seemed to know his own mind, crying lustily when he was hungry or wet or displeased, settling immediately when one of them picked him up and held him. The ranch grew along with their family. By the time James was 2, they had a solid herd of 50 head of cattle and were turning a consistent profit. Vincent hired 2 ranch hands to help with the work, good men who slept in the bunkhouse they had built behind the main house and who treated Theresa with respect and James with indulgence. Theresa started taking in students a few days a week, children from the scattered ranches and farms around Bodie, whose parents wanted them to have some education. She taught them in the front room of the house, the space they had designated as a parlor, but which served just as well as a schoolroom. In 1886, their daughter was born, a tiny, perfect thing they named Helen after Vincent's mother. Where James had been loud and demanding from birth, Helen was quiet and watchful, her dark eyes seeming to take in everything around her with a solemn intensity. She was a daddy's girl from the start, reaching for Vincent whenever he came into the room, crying when he left, settling against his chest with a contented sigh that made his heart feel too big for his body. They added on to the house as the children grew, building more bedrooms, expanding the kitchen, adding a proper porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Vincent planted trees that would someday provide shade, and Theresa started a garden that she tended with the same care and attention she gave to everything she loved. The ranch became known throughout the area for the quality of their cattle and the fairness of their dealings, and Vincent found himself being sought out for advice by younger ranchers just starting out. On a spring evening in 1889, 7 years after the fire that had brought them together, Vincent and Theresa sat on their porch watching their children play in the yard. James, now 5, was teaching 3-year-old Helen how to skip stones in the creek, though she had not quite mastered the technique and kept throwing the stones straight down into the water with a splash. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold, and the air smelled of the wildflowers that covered the meadows this time of year. "Do you ever think about Philadelphia?" Vincent asked, his arm around Theresa's shoulders, her head resting against his chest. "About what your life would have been like if you had taken that money and gone back east?" Theresa was quiet for a moment, considering. "Sometimes," she admitted, "I wonder what it would have been like to live in a city again, to have access to theaters and libraries and all the things I grew up with. But then I look at what we have built here, this life, this family, and I cannot imagine wanting anything different. This is where I belong. This is home." "No regrets?" Vincent asked. "Not a single one," Theresa said firmly, tilting her head up to look at him. "You?" Vincent thought about the scared, heartbroken man he had been when he arrived in Bodie, the one who thought he was done with love and dreams and anything that required vulnerability. He thought about running into a burning building through a blizzard, about carrying Theresa out of the flames, about the moment their eyes had met across the snowy street, and he had known with absolute certainty that his life had just changed forever. He thought about every hard day and every small victory, every moment of doubt and every surge of hope, all the threads that had woven together to create the rich tapestry of their life together. "Not a single one," he echoed, and kissed the top of her head. The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own challenges and triumphs. The ranch prospered, growing to over 300 acres as they were able to buy adjacent parcels from neighbors looking to sell. They weathered droughts and harsh winters, the death of beloved livestock, and the joy of successful breeding seasons. Their children grew strong and healthy, James inheriting his father's skill with horses, Helen showing her mother's head for numbers and organization. In 1892, they had another daughter, Rose, whose arrival was unexpected but welcomed with joy. She was a wild thing from the start, fearless and adventurous, forever climbing trees and chasing after her older siblings and giving her parents heart attacks with her exploits. But she was also sweet and affectionate, quick to hug and kiss, always the first to notice when someone was sad or hurt and needing comfort. Vincent's hands, scarred from the fire, grew even more calloused and weathered from years of ranch work, but they remained capable and strong. He taught his son to rope and brand, taught both his daughters to ride, took pride in passing on the skills he had learned over a lifetime of working with cattle and horses. Theresa's auburn hair began to show threads of silver at the temples, but her eyes remained as green and lively as they had been the first day he saw her. She expanded her teaching, eventually building a small schoolhouse on their property where she taught not just their own children, but a dozen others from the area. They made trips to San Francisco on occasion, grand adventures that the children looked forward to for months. They would stay in a hotel and see the sights, the ocean and the tall ships, the fine stores and restaurants, the bustle and noise of a real city. But they were always glad to return to their ranch, to the quiet and the space and the rhythms of rural life that had become as natural to them as breathing. One evening in the summer of 1895, when James was 11, Helen 9, and Rose 3, the family gathered on the porch after dinner, as was their custom. The children were taking turns telling stories, each one trying to outdo the others with tales of adventure and excitement, and Vincent and Theresa listened with indulgent smiles. When it was Helen's turn, she fixed her parents with a serious look and said she wanted to hear a true story about how they had met and fallen in love. Vincent and Theresa exchanged glances, and then Theresa began to speak, her voice soft and rich with memory. She told them about the fire in the mercantile, about being trapped in the back room with the flames closing in, about the terror and resignation she had felt as she realized she was going to die. Then Vincent picked up the story, describing the blizzard and the orange glow through the snow, the decision to run into the burning building without hesitation. He told them about wrapping his coat in water, about crawling through the smoke, about finding their mother and jumping over a burning beam to reach her. The children were spellbound, even though they had heard versions of this story before, but this time their parents told it together, passing the narrative back and forth, filling in details and emotions that they had never shared before. Theresa described what it felt like to see Vincent appear through the smoke like an answer to a prayer she had not even had time to pray. Vincent admitted how terrified he had been, that he would not reach her in time, that she would die before he could save her, that he would fail in the most important moment of his life. "Were you in love right away?" Rose asked, her eyes wide. Vincent and Theresa looked at each other and smiled. "I do not know if it was love right away," Theresa said slowly, "but it was something. A connection, a recognition that this person was going to be important. The love came after, as we spent time together, as we learned who each other really was beneath the drama of how we met." "But you knew," James said, and it was not a question. "You knew it was going to be something." "Yes," Vincent said simply. "I knew." They sat in comfortable silence after that, watching the sun set, and Vincent reflected on how lucky he had been. He could have died in that fire, could have made any number of different choices that would have led him away from this moment, this family, this life, but he had not. He had run toward the flames instead of away from them, and in doing so, he had found everything he had ever wanted, and so much more than he had ever dared to dream. As the years turned into decades, Vincent and Theresa watched their children grow into adults and start families of their own. James married a rancher's daughter from outside Virginia City, and settled on a piece of land they gifted him from the ranch, building his own house just a mile down the road. Helen became a teacher like her mother, eventually taking over the schoolhouse and bringing new ideas and energy to the education of the area's children. She married a banker from Bodie, a steady, reliable man who treated her like a queen and gave them 2 beautiful grandchildren. Rose was the last to settle down, wild and free-spirited, until she met a mining engineer who could match her energy and sense of adventure. They moved to Nevada for a few years, but eventually came back to California, unable to stay away from the family and the land that had shaped them. Vincent retired from active ranch work in his 50s, turning over the day-to-day operations to James while he served in an advisory role. His body bore the marks of decades of hard labor, the old injuries and the simple wear of time, but his mind remained sharp, and his hands, though scarred and arthritis gnarled, could still gentle a nervous horse or fix a broken fence when needed. Theresa continued teaching until she was 60, finally stepping back to let Helen take over completely, though she still tutored students who were struggling or needed extra help. They spent their later years in gentle leisure, enjoying their grandchildren, maintaining the garden, sitting on the porch in the evenings, just as they always had. Vincent often found himself thinking about the path that had led him here, the choices made and roads taken, the sheer improbable luck of being in the right place at exactly the right moment. If he had left the saloon 5 minutes later that night in 1882, if he had not noticed the glow of the fire through the snow, if he had listened to the man who grabbed his arm and told him he was crazy to run into the burning building, none of this would exist. His children, his grandchildren, the life he and Theresa had built together, all of it hung on those few moments of decision. On a spring morning in 1910, almost exactly 28 years after the fire, Vincent woke early and slipped out of bed without waking Theresa. He made coffee in the kitchen of the house they had built with their own hands, the house that had been expanded and improved over the decades but still retained the bones of that original structure. He carried his cup out to the porch and sat in his favorite chair, watching the sun come up over the mountains that had been his horizon for so long. Theresa joined him a few minutes later, wrapped in a shawl against the morning chill, her own cup of coffee warming her hands. Her hair was white now, her face lined with age, but when she smiled at him, he saw the same woman he had pulled from the flames all those years ago. She sat in the chair beside him, their fingers automatically intertwining in a gesture so familiar it required no thought. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "Everything," Vincent said. "The fire, how we met, the first time I told you I loved you, the day we got married, when the children were born. All of it, all at once." "Are you feeling nostalgic today?" Theresa asked with gentle amusement. "I am feeling grateful," Vincent said. "Grateful for every moment, every choice